Hello, everyone, and welcome to this conversation about imagining learning futures. My name is Punya Mishra, and I'm Associate Dean for Scholarship and Innovation at the Mary Fulton Teachers College at Arizona State University. Thank you all for joining us today for this conversation with multi-award nominated author Shiv Ramdas and Dr. Katina Michael, a colleague of mine and professor at Arizona State University's School for the Future of Innovation and Society. This conversation is part of Future Tense, a partnership between ASU, Slate, and New America that examines the impact of science and technology on society. This particular set of 3 stories is sponsored by the Teachers College on the theme of learning futures. Shiv's story, which we'll be discussing today, is the last of the series. To provide a bit of background, it is clear to all of us that education has been and will continue to be profoundly affected by changes in technology and science, as well as forces like climate change and globalization. And of course, there is tremendous uncertainty about how to navigate these changes. And as we look to the future, I believe it's critically important that we bring our imagination into play. I read this recently that stories are powerful because they are vehicles for imbibing moral worldviews. And they provide us with a unique space and an opportunity to ask, what if? So this set of 3 stories considers how learning may be shaped by new technologies and how individuals, institutions, systems confront these moral and ethical challenges involved. Today, we will be discussing a story written by Shiv called The Trolley Solution and Katina's response to the story from her perspective. A bit of housekeeping before we dive into the conversation. We will save time for questions from all of you towards the end, so please feel free to submit them using the Q&A feature on Zoom. And now I'm excited to start our discussion. I know you are not here to listen to me, so without further ado, let's jump in. Shiv, Katina, welcome. Please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your background. So let's start with you, Shiv.
Hi, thank you for having me, Punya. To those who don't know, my name is Shiv Ramdas. I am an Indian writer of speculative fiction, horror and humor, science fiction, fantasy across the board. I grew up in all over India, really. I was born in Lucknow and I moved to the United States towards the end of 2016, and I've been here since then. And I live and work out of Seattle.
Thank you, Shiv. Katina?
Hello to everyone. Katina Michael. I'm a second-generation Greek Australian. I'm currently coming to you live from Australia in a small town called Gerringong in New South Wales. I've spent a significant part of my career traveling through Asia and North America and occasionally Europe. I was a pre-sales network engineer in industry by training in a large telecommunications manufacturer, which led me to India repeatedly. I was also the Associate Dean International at the University of Wollongong, where I was responsible for student recruitment, quality assurance, partner and twinning education programs in the engineering and information sciences school. So I've got a bit of cultural and intercultural awareness, and I'm highly transdisciplinary. I'm a mother of 3, and I very much respect the lived experience. In fact, I feel very connected to the community around me because I really value simple interactions, simple discussions with mums at swimming lessons, simple discussions with those at a community event. My father was a factory worker, my mother was a cleaner, and they grew up in a remote area of Greece in their respective villages. And I see the world through their eyes, through their journey, many on occasion. And along the way, somehow I got entangled in academia, and I love it.
Thank you, Katina. And now you see why this is going to be such a fun discussion, because we have, I think, 2 very interesting guests here who bring a range of perspectives on this topic of learning futures. So Shiv, let's start with you for those who have not read the story. So without any major spoilers, can you give us a summary of of the story?
Oh, that's always a brutal question, isn't it?
Yes.
All right. So without trying to give too much away, it's essentially a story of a professor who believes he is due tenure at the university he works in. So he is one day notified about a meeting which presumably has to do with that tenure. And during that meeting, he discovers that it's not quite that. And instead, he's going to be involved in this rather bizarre competition because of a university that is very, very actively interested in cost cutting. And that's about as vague as I can be.
Okay. So, and this is a bit of a selfish question on my part, because I'm really always interested in this thing called the creative process. I love listening to authors talk about how they thought things through, movie directors about how they shaped their vision. It's, I think, wishful thinking on my part, that because I wish I was doing work of that caliber and quality. So Shiv, if you can, for instance, one thing I'm really interested in is that authors often talk about how the characters sort of take over, and they are, sort of, you're co-authoring it with the characters and so on. So can you tell us a little bit about the process that you went through in coming up with the story?
Well, so one of the things I wanted to do when I was first contacted to do this story along this theme of education and learning is I wanted to try and find something that I could set in a classroom, because we're over the last year, we've sort of entered this era of sort of a transition in almost like pedagogical tools, essentially, because so much of virtual learning and long distance learning has been required because of this pandemic. And we've discovered a whole new set of problems and a whole new set of variables for teachers and everyone else to deal with. And it's not just teachers, students are having to deal with this stuff, parents are having to deal with this stuff, and it's all very new territory for everyone. So I just figured that setting something that was almost entirely played out in white space or in virtual space, so to speak, like almost all in fact, every interaction in this story happens remotely. That's true. So one thing I wanted to do was I wanted to play with white space in the telling of a story. And well, I suppose we can get into themes and stuff later, but the process in itself involved trying to come up with a situation that explored, well, in a nutshell, science fiction basically pretends to explore the future, but what it actually does, it presents a vision of the present, right? And or a direction of the present. And that is what I wanted to do with the story, while using white space and using the motif of the trolley problem, which thanks to pop culture has become the defining quote unquote ethical dilemma of our times. So using these two different motifs, I wanted to sort of create a story that explored a possible future of the direction of education and the nature of learning.
Thank you, Shiv. So with that, Katina, you wrote a response, which is taking on one, because I know you had a lot of thoughts about this and we'll get to that. But you wrote this piece for Slate, which is like how much of higher education can be automated. So can you give us a glimpse of that, or what your thinking was in that piece? And we'll come to the alternatives in a second.
So the first thing I wrote to Shiv was, man, you're a prophet. I thought the future is here now. I thought, oh my goodness, he's talking about this institution and he must have heard the story about that institution and the failure of the bots in that one. I actually thought you had inside knowledge. So friends, this is happening now, not some future story. And we already have some shocking realities being played out. Oh, we invested 300,000 in this bot because we imagined that the computers and the learning management system could take care of itself without a single administrator or faculty member. And guess what? Surprise, surprise, the money has gone down the toilet. So I guess this reality is playing out. And I think it has something to do with a bizarre force called greed, maybe. And that's the first thing. The second thing I thought is that this is a trade-off between the man, Ahmed, and the software, this disembodied person named Ali. And it was a deliberate play on the kind of Terminator motif that Shiv was latching onto. But the truth really is that if we scratch beneath the surface, we realize, and I won't spoil the ending, but that humans do need machines. We do need the tools that we are building. But my personal stance is that we need more humans to orient the machine. So I'm thinking of a future of education where there are all of these different specialized people supporting learning and development, not just these machines sort of teaching humans.
Thank you, Katina. And we will dig into both the higher ed and the trolley problem in a little bit. But I want to also, because I know you wrote, I think, 3 different kinds of responses in Slate, or 4, and Slate took one. And one was, which I thought was most interesting, was from the point of view of the machine. And I thought that was particularly interesting. So you were writing a piece of fiction in response to the fiction. And I'm sort of reminded, and we talked about this earlier, of Kazuo Ishiguro's latest novel, which is again told from the point of view of a virtual friend. So these are things that are around us now, and they are real psychologically and in other ways, real in many ways. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, just a little bit on that one of 4 or 5 concepts. And Shiv's writing is so brilliant, everyone, that it makes you think Ali is real. That's the craziness. And in concept, it is real. We are talking about it today. The AI-fied education system, or the AI-fied or gigafied or Uberized system of disintermediation. So Ali as the protagonist was the first concept I had, and I wanted to get the inside, the thought process of Ali. And of course, I thought to myself, Katina, you've been sucked in by Shiv's writing, his wonderful penning. Machines don't think, I thought to myself, they compute and they calculate. They are fed data and then they can make sense of data. So Shiv, you got me. But does Ali really think is a good question.
Yeah, and I think that's what's interesting. And I want to move a little bit into the whole trolley problem, which, the trolley solution, which Shiv, you titled the story. Because I think that idea comes up multiple times in the narrative. It's the first time it's mentioned by one of the administrators when they have to take a difficult decision. And then, of course, there is the whole point of Ahmed, the character, actually using that as a writing exercise and being upended in some way. And then I think the overall story itself sort of has that element of unasking that question. And I think, Shiv, you have some thoughts about sort of why this problem was taken and what you have done to make it more complicated. And I think that's really interesting for us to hear a little bit.
Well, the trolley problem itself is like extraordinarily famous in the sense that like it was really in vogue like about 20, 30, 40 years ago, and then it sort of like vanished and then it reappeared. And I'm not really sure whether it's because of like the TV show that referenced it all the time, whether it became famous, or because of the fact it was coming back into vogue, it came into the, like, I'm not really sure which is the chicken and which is the egg in this case, but the fact is, in terms of pop culture, it is one of the more popular meme-worthy ethical questions / dilemmas of our time. And it's a purely theoretical one, obviously, because we don't really have a situation, thankfully, where multiple people are being tied to parallel tracks and then everyone is being asked to decide and so on and so forth. And like most of the ethical problems, like the thing with the trolley problem is that it exists for the process of sort of like vocalizing or thinking your way through the options of solution as opposed to the solution it itself comes up with. But then again, like it's really a macabre way of thinking about ethics in the sense that I'm sure there are many ways to discuss ethics that don't involve choosing how many people to kill and why. So from that point of view, the direct unasking of the question or the unlearning of the premise of the question becomes very clearly the solution to the trolley problem is stop tying people to tracks.
And I think that one of the things that it brought up in my mind was this sort of whole unasking, this like, why is this even, in which kind of a universe would this be a reality? And what does it tell you about the universe we live in that we think this is something that is worthwhile? And what are the systems in place that brought these people into tying them up, right? I mean, I think that's one of the things that sort of emerged in, I think, the thinking. So Katina, I know you have worked at this interface of technology and ethics and so on. And I'd love to hear sort of your take on how this problem pops up in most discussions of AI and, intelligent cars and, so on.
Yes, it keeps coming up at conferences. It's quite uncool to actually bring it up these days. Although some people are still trying to solve the problem, they'll probably spend a lifetime trying to solve the problem. It's unsolvable, right? And when we look at artificial intelligence and autonomous systems and the infinite choices, the infinite paths, the infinite approaches of unsupervised learning and supervised learning in terms of the machine learning space, we really don't have a proper response. All we're told by Shiv is that machines don't do context well, they don't do consequences, and they don't do conflict well. The 3 C's, so context, consequences, and conflict, are those that emerge as principles coming out of Ahmed, the creative writing professor in the story. And so I want to ponder on this concept that we're still realizing our potential as human beings, but also that we are different and yet there's sameness about us. We're not copies of each other like machines are. And we have uniqueness, right? Our biometrics are unique. But we need machines to help us in the care process, but we need people to care more, right? And so machines are not the silver bullet solution painted out in the short story. The person is still changeable, but also I think we need to know that we can't control everything. As humans, we know this. We don't have answers for everything. And I think that's okay. But we forget about that. We forget that there's not a scientific evidence-based solution to all the questions. If I pose the question like, why did a relative of mine lose both her sons in their 20s and 30s, and they were her only children, and she survived her children? There is no response to that. Computers don't really die, people die. And so there are questions we can't really answer, and I think that's the mystery of being human.
Oh, Shiv, I was seeing you nod your head, so I think maybe what were you thinking at that moment?
Well, I'm just thinking about like how relevant that particular response is in this day and age, where a lot of the time logic is presented as some kind of fait accompli or some best possible response, in terms of people are told X, Y, and Z solution is not logical. Like when you get to questions like immigration or acceptance of refugees or various other things, you'll always have somebody who pops up saying that's not a logical solution. Well, if everything had to be purely logical as a solution, we could just replace human beings with abacuses, you know? The whole point of being human is we don't make purely logical solutions. Like emotions are supposed to come into it.
Oh, that's a wonderful, wonderful point. In fact, just yesterday, I was listening to an interview with Ted Chiang on the Ezra Klein podcast, and he said something that literally blew my brain away. So he was being asked about, like, do you think AI will ever be a moral agent, which is sort of relevant to this conversation. So I was like, oh, wow, I can't believe they're talking about what we'll be talking about tomorrow. And this is what he said. And this is just, I had never thought of it from that perspective. And he said that this fear about AI running our lives or making people lose jobs, he said, I'm not worried about that. He says, what I'm worried about is in the process of creating AI, which can be a moral agent, we are going to create a whole bunch of AIs in between who will undergo suffering. He said, we all know a dog is not a moral agent, but can suffer. And so he says that from an ethical point of view, we should not create moral agent AI, because in the process, we will cause the preliminary versions will be like a little baby, will be like a dog, will be like a mouse. And the way we have treated these creatures in our lives, in some ways tells us we should not do it with software. You know what I mean? I mean, that's it just flipped the idea in my head of AI and so on. And then it started making me think about Ali, and, if he's such a good teacher, then how is he building that? Does he actually have empathy on what's going on there? And what does that mean? And does he agonize over questions? What is the next story? Like, do androids dream of electric sheep? And it just raised a whole array of new puzzlements and wonderments in my mind, just from listening to that conversation. So this is not a question. This is really just a statement, and hoping to get some response from you guys and your thoughts about this idea, because I was like blown away by it yesterday.
Katina, would you like to start?
Thank you, Shiv. I'd love to. At the conclusion of my response piece, triggered by that beautiful writing of Shiv Ramdas, I come to the conclusion that machines are quite different to us. They don't bleed. For that matter, your concept of suffering and the notion of moral agents and suffering, the risk is different. Perhaps there's a risk of a machine getting wet, but machines don't have a DNA, not yet anyway. Machines don't thirst. Machines don't have to pay taxes, although that may change in the future, as we've seen in the economics literature. And machines don't die. And so what empathy can there be when there is no ultimate risk or conclusion? There's no breath. I look at humans in my own belief system as God breathed. There's something that's making them real. There's something that says to them, it's a new morning. There's something that's saying to them, look at the sun, it's so beautiful. There's something that's saying to them, I want to be able to tell the person next to me, I love you. I love you with all your faults. I love you with all your perfections. I love you with everything. I love your face. I love everything. The songs that we write about this love, this empathy, this care, the machines are never going to be able to write this. They're never going to be able to write a story like Shiv Ramdas. Shiv, you didn't use an AI to write that story, did you?
Well, I did use my brain. Like, I don't know. That is an I at least, so we're halfway there.
So I'm going to use this segue. Thank you, Katina, for what you just said, because there is such a deeply humanistic perspective that you're bringing, such a respect of the individual, even how you described yourself and your parents in your life, and particularly what you said just now. And what does that mean for higher ed or education in general, where these humanistic perspectives and approaches get subverted or undermined by broader economic pressures? And that was, I think, a very big theme in the previous story by Lee Alexander as well, which was about this person who works as one of the what do you call them, the affiliate faculty, where they have really no standing within the organization. There is no tenure for them. There's no nothing for them. They get paid some little bit of money. So both these stories have that in common. And I was wondering if, Katina, you could speak to this one, because you are in academia and you have been thinking about these issues around technology and the pressures that it has put on us, whether due to COVID or otherwise. Where do you think this is leading us, and what are some implications of that?
I'm going to say, I'm actually really angry, Punya. And I don't get angry about hardly anything. I think things are going in the wrong direction, and many universities and academic institutions today saying we're not going to be able to sustain the blow of COVID. A stemming of international students may be coming to Australia, to New Zealand, to the UK, to the US, to Canada. And the notion is we have to get rid of people, but let's rank the people first, as if we're quantified beings. Let's rank them based on some short-sighted benchmark. And then if they don't fit the bill, we set a benchmark that some people it's impossible for the majority even to reach, and we get rid of them. They're deadwood. It's our opportunity to make change. And there's no empathy there. There is no empathy for this context. And so these benchmarks are unachievable, and students are left to fend for themselves, asking questions to machines. There's utter confusion. We'll just run the class without the teachers. We'll use the LMS, the learning management system, with materials from possibly dead professors, and their exams can be multiple choice. We can get Moodle to mark the multiple choice, and voila, we've got our solution. So we've got international students paying these prohibitive sums of money for a quality education, and we are not en masse in the world providing quality to our students who deserve more time and more of our mental space. So I want to get over the fact that financial controllers are starting to take over academic institutions, that the worst instance is poor management. And I will point the finger at incompetent executives that say, we're going to save on the administrator cost of the main switch. The main switch of the university will not have a human being behind it. And we've got these students calling up with inquiries, hanging onto the main switch for about 30 minutes. And then we've got the executive saying, see, we saved $30,000 of someone's salary. There's no one to answer the phones. Do we honestly think students and parents of students in international locations are going to swallow this new normal? Absolutely not. If we don't change, our academic sector is in trouble. That's what I want to end with. So I am angry.
Wow. I just got a message on Slack from one of our people on the back saying that she's so loving this conversation. So I just wanted to say that. So one thing that Shiv, when we talked over the weekend, you had said that you are actually getting some feedback from higher ed folks who have responded to your story. And I thought that was very interesting. It's what kinds of sort of messages or comments or emails or Twitter threads or responses have you been getting?
Yeah, it was very surprising. I did not expect this much response/feedback from the academic community, but a lot of them are just sharing it and telling me about how this story talks about stuff they worry about, that they see happening, that they see could be happening in the future, that they're worried about happening to colleagues in other places, in places that they're associated with, that kind of thing. So, I mean, a lot of it draws on what like Katina just said in terms of like a balance sheet starting to control everything else, and what aspects, essentially, it's a question of value, right? Like we're talking about value addition constantly, and someone is there out there like putting certain weightages on different values, as opposed to let's just take the example that she just quoted, like someone saved $30,000 on a switchboard, but how many hours of time of value were eaten up of those students and parents on the other end? Like you've cost them $50,000 worth of their time. So at the end of the day, you're still robbing Peter to pay Paul, right? It's just that because Peter happens to be the someone you claim is your end use customer, it's okay to shortchange them twice.
Wow. So I love the word value that you just mentioned, Shiv, because there are sort of two meanings to value. So one is value is it's this whole thing of the cynic who knows the price of everything, but not the value of nothing. And so there is this one, which is the monetary value or value in that sense. But there is a deeper meaning to the word value, which is the values, the moral and ethical principles that we bring to the work at hand. And I think that at some level, maybe what we have is that we haven't been able to balance those two values. We have given one way more weightage than the other, or that the conversation has shifted too much towards sort of the financial value or the number value that we can put on something, as opposed to things which are harder, which to me, to me, this is really interesting, is like, that learning for me has always been about expanding your horizons, of changing the way you see yourself with relationship to the world, to other people. And that requires connection, that requires empathy, that requires, a lot of these human related factors, which seem to be sort of moving out of the equation to be replaced by a much more transactional or sort of an instrumental sort of a mindset there.
You're talking about feasibility, Punya, and usually we look at feasibility in the design process as being technical, operational, and economic. Where the heck is social feasibility here? Social feasibility. We talk about the minimum viable product, and I was corrected by a peer in user experience. He said, Katina, stop talking about MVP, minimum viable product. He said, start talking about minimum valuable product, valuable product. And what you're talking about here, Punya, is the alignment. Do we think that behavioral engineering of machines are going to mentor our young people to be the next leaders in the world? What will that do to them? Where is the care? Where is the care management? Where is the care leadership, right, for this next generation? And what you're talking about is this beautiful thing that happens in the classroom when we're shoulder to shoulder. People have been congregating for millions of years in some form, however long the world has been in existence for, whatever that is in your calendar, 5,000 years as humans, for example. We have always gone shoulder to shoulder. We break bread together. We are together. We are connected. We are in this synthesis. We are somehow helping each other to get to the next stage, whatever that is for each person individually. But if we lose this proximity, which we are, firstly, in ourselves, we've become less connected with ourselves. We don't even know what we stand for in values anymore. We've become less connected with our children, with our family, with our partners, with our friends. I'll see you when I see you. Don't call me, just SMS. And we've become more disconnected as a society. We're killing each other. Why? Why are we not looking at fundamental values to help coordinate and deliver better solutions for ourselves, for the collective? It's always, I'm too busy, I don't have time, the machine, I've got too many emails, I've got too many deadlines. No, we've got to break with this machine-like movement and say, return to humanity. And I'd love to hear what Shiv has to say on his values, because it's all in his article.
Go ahead, Shiv.
What's the question of like how you define values and who defines values, right? Like, because to take the example of the story, like every single person in that story has a value system. It's just that they happen to differ, and some people get to impose value systems on others, which is pretty much a metaphor for society at large, really, if you think about it.
That's right.
But in the larger context of this, so if you think about it, like the main character goes into this with this understandably or justifiably antagonistic feeling towards a machine, and he sort of sees that machine as being the issue, and he is correct, except that he's sort of wrong in his diagnosis of what is the machine, because the machine isn't necessarily the AI. The machine is the system that puts that AI there. And all of us spend so much time battling the AI in our workplace that we forget to actually look at the machine, so to speak.
That is wonderful. Yeah, go ahead, Shiv.
And I do believe that is feature and not bug. Like one of the things that does come about from building systems like this is individualism, and making people fight individual battles is really, really useful to systems, because collective action is what dismantles systems.
Interesting. So I love this idea that the machine is the one that we think is the machine is not the machine. It's the structure that allows for certain kinds of interactions to happen and defines interaction in certain ways. That is actually the machine that is hidden from all of us. I love that. So there's a couple of...
Punya, there's one other thing here. We can't see the machine that Shiv is talking about because we're too busy like this. We can't see it. We don't take the God view or the sky view or the on top to see the world view. We're too busy like this. So we can't see it. We've become blind. That's why we can't see the gobble machine. It's not the machine that we think, as Shiv says. We can't see it. We've become blind. We've got screens in front of our eyes. We're not disconnecting. Once you disconnect for a little while, you see things clearer. That's why writers are so brilliant at this effort.
That's exactly what I was saying, which is why we have the series, because it allows us to explore these topics in ways which are really powerful and evocative. And one of my favorite quotes about worldviews is that a worldview sees everything except itself. And when it says everything, it's because the worldview defines what everything is. That's your lens now. What it cannot see doesn't exist for it. And it obviously cannot see itself. And I think that's part of what's going on. We have a couple of comments here and questions. So one, just an appreciative comment from a student, Katina, who really appreciates the angry voice in support of international students. Not only the academic system still providing traditional channels of learning, but also during the pandemic, some online services like mental health were not available to students who left their university countries, universities for home countries. So again, I think this brings back this issue of that universities, schools are broader systems, not just for the transmission of knowledge from one brain to the other, but they perform a much bigger humanistic role of development, both social, emotional, citizenship, global, local. And I think that was one comment that was there. And I'm just looking at a couple of other ones. And maybe you can comment, Katina or Shiv, on this while I just abstract the questions that are there into one question. All right, so let me take this on. So,
I just want to say the faculty are in the same position as the students. Our hearts are crying out when there's not enough time in the day to respond. I would love an AI that would help me do better scheduling and logistics. It's not that I don't have time, it's that I don't have the capacity to work across zones, and the administrative support would be huge. I'm not talking about the wondrous work at ASU, by the way. But there are additional things. It comes back to care. It comes back to somebody having a feedback loop to say, I know you're in this situation. We're looking into it. We will help you. And this is the thing. I just want to show you this. It's this. It's this. We are feeling less of this. I need your hand. Reach out to me, grab it and help me. We don't have that. And getting on a hotline, like all these mental health services now that have had to move online. I know neighbors of mine who, some of whom have bipolar or other conditions, who have waited 3 months to see a doctor in Australia when we have the least COVID rates. And then they get 10 minutes and then they're handed some prescription pills to go, just take this, you'll be all right. No, we're not going to be all right. And the mental health conditions are actually causing allostatic overload. According to one of the professors, Christine Paraxelis, forget about achieving anything in the world. If this is overloaded, right? We start to stop. We say, I can't respond to just another email, another exam, another. So we've got to stop here. Not stop as in stop and not advance. We've got to care enough to make this better. Our mental health has to be stronger. There's not a single person I know that hasn't said, oh, this has been a tough period during COVID.
Yes. So thank you. So just to follow up on that, Shiv, I'm going to take a question from Rick McGrath here, where and this is sort of, I think, along the same lines of what Katina was saying, which is, and you deliberately in your story chose that the course to be about creative writing. I mean, you didn't choose coding, for instance, right? You chose creative writing. So the question was, can a machine teach thought processes beyond teaching information and skill. Once value judgments are needed as part of the decision, do we need people to orient the machine to handle the possible? So again, it speaks to this partnership that Katina has been mentioning and you have also talked about. So Shiv, your thoughts?
See, I think this is a very loaded question always, because like in fiction, especially, we have this very, very long-standing tradition of treating like the human input as definitively superior to machine input. Like every single problem that machines present is because some human has programmed them into them. Like the biases showed my various algorithms are put there by people, which is like, this is one of the largest conversations going on at the current point, right? Like we've all heard about like the Google fiasco and so on and so forth. And there's this whole thing also about like the self-driving cars that were actually looking for pedestrians. There was one incident like that. The virtual learning space has, over the last year, has caused all kinds of problems. There was a case that I found out about when I was researching the story, where there was a student who was, I believe, of African-American descent, who was trying to give an SAT or something and was not able to do so because the algorithm refused to recognize that he was actually looking into the camera, because it essentially kept on saying, turn on light, and we all know why that was happening. And these are not the kind of errors that the machine or the AI comes up with by itself, right? Like, people don't learn bias on their own. Like, people are also taught bias in a lot of ways.
Right.
So the source of all of this is people at the end of the day, right? Like, so, when we're talking about the biases of machines, what we're actually really talking about is the biases of people. And then we use machines as this layer of insulation to pretend that people don't come with these problems.
Right.
So
that was one of the concepts.
Get better people, really.
Right. So, you mentioned, I don't know who mentioned this at some point about the dead professor. I don't know how many people know that story of a student who was emailing the professor and then found out that, and then Googled them and found their obituary. And so the university had been using this professor's content. I mean, I can't think of if somebody would write this in a story, I would think it was implausible. And it is a real story, right? It's a real thing. Katina.
So this is going to happen. This is happening. And this is the thing, what you're talking about with the surveillance cameras. I want you to imagine a future where we want to create the ultimate AI, swarm intelligence, cloud computing, quantum machine, right? It's global. So what we're going to do, we're going to put cameras everywhere. We're going to put audio recorders everywhere. We're going to transcribe every conversation, every movement. Look how Katina moves and look at her background. Look at Shiv's movements. I'm going to disintermediate the individual. I'm going to disentangle them to the lowest bits and pieces, right? The lowest bits and bytes. So every human being, 7 billion of us at the moment, let's imagine every conversation captured via some device sitting on the lapel. Let's imagine every point of view captured, every scene we've ever lived, every conflict, every love, everything. Now we say to the AI, okay, there was a character called the Prophet Muhammad. There was a character called Jesus Christ. There was a character called Solomon. There was a character called Katina Michael and Shiv Ramdas. Let's create an AI-fied notion of all of them, and let's give the machine learning enough space, engineer it to gobble up the best of the best human values, the best teachings, the best commandments, the best life, the best events, the best of everything. And we can create a heaven on earth. That's what's being sold to us, ladies and gentlemen, on technology, the AI, the AI-fied factory floor with no humans. But that's the problem. There are no humans in this AI space. And so what I want to get back to is the surveillance mechanisms, what Zuboff calls surveillance capitalism, what MG Michael calls uberveillance since 2006. This is the issue, because what we think we're going to do is give the machine more of the same and feed it the behaviors, the characteristics, the traits, the reactions of people, and it will learn the best of the best and it will give us the best of the best. Wouldn't that be nice?
But see, best
Share
is
your thoughts.
Really, sorry.
No, go ahead. I'm just asking you to continue.
Oh, I was just thinking along the line that best in itself is like such a loaded term, right? Like best means a lot of things to a lot of people. And so, for instance, we live in this era of like fundamental dichotomy in like what we talk about, right? For instance, crony capitalism and tax cuts for the very rich are sold to us as a social good. Like xenophobia is sold as nationalism and patriotic pride. Like we live in an era where what we say and what we do are like two almost opposite things. And a lot of not very nice things are sold to us as being actually great and in line with all kinds of liberal and progressive values. And the word best comes up a lot in these contexts, you know?
Yes. So
I mean,
I have this one.
We recently had a president of the United States who loved that word.
So I have actually a pet peeve or rant that I have about this whole idea of best practices. Because anytime you go to any professional development or something for education, it's like, what we need to do is identify best practices. And at the same time, we also say that context is everything. And so moment we say context is everything, best becomes contextual. And then what we transfer over, so the issue, so I have this term that I use, which is pretty good practice. Can you hear me?
Yeah, Punya, your audio went out.
Is it better now?
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay, sorry. So I have this acronym which I call PGP, which is pretty good practice. That's the best as humans we can do most of the time. And I think if you put machines in the mix, it's pretty much that's the best that we can do as well. I'm looking at the time. I want to actually shift the conversation a little bit in a slightly different topic. There are some comments from people. Somebody said, thanks for the panel of passion and provocations. Rage Against the Machine could soundtrack this session. I thought that was wonderful. I want to switch tack a little bit. So one of the things, Shiv, it seems sort of a deliberate move on your part is sort of to expand the range of characters that typically science fiction talks about, right? And we have seen that across all our stories. The first one had a kid in Africa communicating with a hyena. So we expanded that notion. In the second one, there are all these AI elements and, everything sort of being mediated through a screen. And then this, and where I think it was taking a feminist perspective towards technology. And then in this story, you have situated in India. I love the use of certain names. So for instance, the story starts with the character getting an email from Niyati, which if you go Google is destiny. And I love the fact that you got an email from your destiny. So can you speak a little bit about how you approach this work? What in terms of as an author of science fiction, and then Katina, I'll turn to you after that to look at the work that you have been doing around sort of the principal uses of technology and to bring more inclusive voices and perspectives into that. So maybe Shiv, start with you.
Well, when it comes to my own fiction, like we tend to be informed in terms of our own experiences, and we see the world, as you were talking about, through our own worldview. So my worldview is very much Indian. I'm born in India, I've grown up in India, I've lived there most of my life. So it is only natural that the characters and contexts I think of tend to come from the places I'm most familiar with. To deal with the question at a more holistic level, yes, I think it's important because traditionally a whole lot of science fiction has been very Western and white in its output. And the fact is, like, even a lot of those histories are like very, very fictional. Like you have these, there was this whole spate in the 50s and even later of like these idealized versions of a white Europe as the basis for virtually all fantasy novels, which is not even true to the actual history of Europe, right? The historical Europe is in fact was a fairly diverse place with people from all over the place. Like there are Viking articles of clothing we have with Arabic script on them. I mean, that's something that never shows up in a story about Vikings, does it?
Right.
So history itself is extraordinarily diverse. And for some reason, science fiction and fiction in general tend to have like sort of written itself into these English language, white dominated silos. And the world is much more diverse. And I think it enriches fiction to just broaden that perspective. For instance, like you have this whole spate of dystopias, which are essentially people from the West writing how 90% of the world live and pretending that if it happened to them, it would be a gigantic disaster in the future. And the rest of the world reads those stories and be like, that's where I live, like.
Wonderful, Shiv. Thank you for that. That changes the way I think about dystopian. It really does. Thank you, sir. Again, the point is very well taken. And I'm just speaking as myself, and I think we talked about this, is growing up reading a lot of literature, which was always in the West. I remember when I used to start writing stories, I would write stories which would have dollars and cents in them when I had never seen a dollar in my life. And I think what was a transformative moment for me was reading Salman Rushdie's Midnight's Children for the first time, where it was like, oh, you can talk about me and you can use Indian words and not like, explain it. There is no glossary, because this is just what it is, and work your way through the text and you will gain a rich, nuanced world that you can now imbibe and live in and engage with those characters. I think that was transformative for me personally growing up. And so that brings me to Katina, because you work in this intersection of technology and people. And one of the things that has become very clear is that though these technologies on the surface may be neutral or appear neutral, that they are actually disenfranchising or not allowing a variety of voices to come in, either as creators or users. And so can you speak a little bit to that and some of your work in that space?
Yes, for sure. I mean, Shiv, I grew up with the World Book Encyclopedia, as most families did in Australia, most migrant families. It was, in the library, prized possession, and you'd open up to the entry on China. And of course, you got the world according to America about China, because it was a World Book Encyclopedia. And then you travel to China and you think, wow. And then you think, look at the size of this place. Look at the technology rollout. Look at the coordination for whatever purpose, even when we're comparing economic systems. And then you say to yourself, well, what is this all about? It is about histories. It is about who's writing, who's got the pen, and who's got the loudest voice on the internet today. And that's interesting because we have a small percentage of the population steering the conversation so powerfully on the internet. And so what is the machine, Shiv, as you questioned before? Who is the greatest disinformer is a very good politically motivated question. What is disinformation? From who? From where? Where is the propaganda coming from? What is truth? All of these incredible, massive questions that the internet, which was supposed to be this free vehicle, allowing freedom of speech and human rights declarations, has become almost usurped by the commercial dollar, of course, and by the few voices who have the power and know how the machine works. I campaign, I put out my messages, I micro-target now using these amazing AI systems, and I can get a sentiment response and a change possibly in sentiment. So what I'm looking at mainly in my research are the injustices. It's not the justices. The justices are great. The injustices is what we have to look at, whether it's social injustice, child abuse injustice, political injustice, freedom of thought and spiritual belief injustice, injustice of environmental damage. And our systems need to respond to this. We need to start talking to humans. We need not to look at an area in India, like when I was a telecommunications engineer, and I'd go through my GIS sitting in Wollongong, I'd go, oh, using this geographic information system, oh yeah, I can roll out like this. I didn't care about the people as an engineer. I did not ask the question, how much money are they earning per day? I just saw them as a figure. There's 1 million people in this particular city. Okay, we can sell this much CCTV. How do we know? Because we know they love TV, and we know they love mobiles, and we know we can build and they will come. This is the wrong mentality. Public interest technology is all about the opposite. I ask, I observe, I talk to the people, I interview the people, I understand their culture, I empower them to build systems. I don't go in and say, I will build.
Oops, I think we lost Katina. I think she will jump back on because she was worried about that. So Shiv, if you want to follow through on some of your thoughts around this topic, because I think this idea of increasingly, I have become sensitive to this idea of representation, because particularly, and coming from India, being upper caste and so on, I was blind to so many things, and to open your eyes to some of those things suddenly changes the way, you see the world and how it works.
Well, absolutely. And I mean, representation changes how we see media in itself, if you know what I mean. It's like, for instance, like if you take the whole concept of Superman, like there was at some point, like he almost became like a figure of like nationalistic pride, right? Like, because at some point they inserted that whole aspect of truth, justice, and the American way, which wasn't there earlier. So even within the highly represented spaces, you have specific kinds of representation which are pushed. And it also becomes a vehicle. I'm going to keep talking about comic books for a second, because comic book movies are like the oeuvre of our time right now. So if you take the most famous villain from them. You take a Thanos. Like, what is Thanos? Thanos is basically Malthusian theory on steroids, right? And both of these things have been debunked. The use of steroids has been very roundly debunked as not necessarily very good for you, and Malthusian theory has been debunked as not very good for you. And movies about a person who is not caught up with these two facts make millions and billions of dollars every year.
Right, right.
So,
Sorry to have lost you for a second, Katina. Welcome back. Thank you.
Yeah, do you want to pick up your point? We were just...
Yeah, the public interest technology, that's where you were talking about.
We need to deliberate. We can't roll out systems that we need quickly. We need to go slow down a bit. We need to do the right things. We need to interact and empower communities. I don't want Zuckerberg flying into India on the one laptop per child, ending up on the front of the Economist and saying, I will save the world. This is wrong. We need to empower the Indians, and the Indians have gone through a very interesting sort of last 9 months in particular with trying to think about homegrown innovation. You would know more, Punya, perhaps, and Shiv, of this initiative, which is, let's look at our own ingenuity. What do our people require? And we will build systems with them, not for them. That's co-design. I do it with you. I empower you. I don't own you. You're not a number.
Well, the fundamental problem with all these systems, in a sense, is that all these systems which are supposedly being built for long-term outcomes are being built by people who have very specific short-term objectives. You know, like even if you take the story at the end of the day, like the person who is signing off on some strange commodification of education or cutting down of budgets is doing so because in 6 months he's going to sit in front of his boss at his appraisal and say, hey, you know what, I saved all this money, give 1% of it to me or whatever, give me this bonus. And B will drive A, and justifications for the former will be found because of the need of the individual for the latter. So right. In the sense, systems are also extremely informed by the individuals in them. So it's a big wiggly wobbly, complicated problem, which requires, I think, multifaceted solutions. Like we tend to also be very, very driven by one-point solutions and magic bullets and things of that sort. And problems themselves are mostly amalgamations, right? So I think solutions also need to be like more amalgamative in that sense.
Yeah, and I think this is, sorry, Katina,
yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, it's interesting that the people that are making these decisions actually are not accountable people. They are shifting roles quite often. They're transferring to other units in government agencies, in businesses. So they're only accountable until that pay rise and until the next job. What we need is accountability metrics where the person goes, oh, I didn't meet my KPI and got the raise, and then I'm going to another university to become like some kind of vice chancellor or something, or president. We need people like President Crow to stick in their roles for a long time and see through change and innovation, because that's when things matter, not these short-term, as you say, Shiv, KPIs that are met. And oh, by the way, I've made a tragic mistake in the faculty. Now I get to leave and you can deal with the mess that I've left behind. That's horrible.
And a lot of time, the people making these decisions are not necessarily from within the matrix. Like there's this whole like sub ecosystem of consultants who come in and make all kinds of decisions and recommendations, and then they leave and somebody else is mopping it all up. Like very rarely will you find one of these external consultants say, yeah, just fire 500 people, but he's not going to sit there and fire those 500 people and look them in the eye. Like he's going to write his report and he's going to push off and say, like, please send the fee to the company.
That's what I call the Uberization, right? The Uberization of education. And you are right. These are these hotshot external consultants coming in, just doing the kill and leaving. This is horrible, horrible.
And so short-term thinking is the issue in the sense that that's how you end up with stuff like that famous Philip Morris memo from the 1980s, right? Like where one executive thought it was a fantastic idea to write an actual memo saying, let's target children for cigarette sales, because they will grow up and smoke cigarettes for years and years. And that's a lot of money. And I'm sure he thought he was doing a brilliant thing, which would earn him a bonus.
Sure. So two things here. So one is one of my favorite people is this guy called Anurag Behar, who heads this Azim Premji Foundation in university. And he was asked this question in a panel discussion once, like, what is the role of data in your decision-making? And his response, I loved that, was he said, the need for data is a function of your distance from the phenomenon. The further away you are, so like Katina, what you said, that you could sit and look in a GIS system, the more distance you are from the phenomena, the numbers become more meaningful. So part of what he talks about is how much time he spends going from his school site to school site, because then he doesn't depend on some spreadsheet, but it depends on what he's actually seeing in front of him. The second point I want to emphasize here, which I think is really interesting, there's this book by this woman called Zia Tong. I don't remember the name of the book. She talks about the things that are invisible. And she starts with the scientific things, right? The quarks and the muons and these the supermassive black holes, but then moves a little further and talks about institutions, power structures, systems, which are invisible to us. So one of the points you raised, and this, I didn't realize this, but we have video cameras everywhere, like you said, but 3 places where we don't are where our food comes from. We never get to see that entire animal industrial complex that creates, inhumanly treats these animals and gets the food to us. We don't see where the waste goes. So those are things which, again, coming back to this idea of worldviews, coming back to this idea of systems, is what are we not seeing in this process? And I think that to me is like really at some level, the biggest takeaway from the story is about that these characters are are acting in a play which was actually predetermined for them in some way by hidden forces that they don't even see or acknowledge. I don't know what your thoughts are on that. And I'm looking at the time here for 4 minutes. Let's get some final thoughts on this, and then we can I can head into wrap up.
Well, that's one reason why to wrap a few things up in this response, like that's one reason why one of the first named characters here is called Niyati or Destiny in the story, right? So it's not necessarily saying that everything is preordained, but there is a certain aspect of inevitability in a lot of these interactions. So, and that's one of the reasons I do little things like this in terms of my stories. Like there's always a little something there for someone who speaks the language, like an Easter egg or something of that sort.
Sure.
But in terms of the larger context of the problem, it's really like my hope from the story is like it helps us just talk about a lot of these questions. It's not so much supposed to provide answers, it is supposed to say, are we asking the right questions? Which is essentially the fundamental learning the main character himself does through the story, right? Like he spends his time focusing on one problem while not realizing that there is another much larger problem. And he is in fact a variable in that equation or problem.
Katina, last thoughts before I do the wrap up.
Your examples were spot on, Punya. I want to talk about proximity, face-to-face proximity. Zoom has been great, so has all the other synchronous modes of communication. They help us to do things like this today. I'm all for technology that aids the human experience, that aids the things that you were talking about, looking at authentic processes and ensuring accountability and transparency and auditability. Yes, the evidence is important, but when we have this notion of dynamic management capability in the business world, all about steering the machines in a particular way, that's okay. But as I was asked at one New South Wales health promotion at a state level event some years ago that was on AI, what do we need, Katina? I said, we need more budget for more humans. We need more budget for more humans. We need to door knock and get with the community again and say, how are you feeling? Do you know about our latest health promotion? Do you know about diabetes? Do you know about heart stroke? Do you know about fatty foods? We need to get to the grassroots and not say to ourselves, if we launch the drones, they will surveil and they will give us the answer and they will do it with great ease and the satellites and the GIS will help us. No, we are missing this human connection, and the distance, more it grows, the less effective computing systems we're going to have and the more failures in systems we're going to have. I want to empower communities.
Yeah, so just to add on to that, like one last thing, I think the real question is like, it's not so much like the surface, it's like an iceberg, right? Like the problem is mostly under the surface. So whereas the overt question, like in this story, is why do we need a machine? The actual question is like, why are there people who think we need that machine? If you know what I mean.
Yes, and I think that goes to sort of the worldview that sees everything but itself, because it's defined the world in a certain way. I am sensitive to the time here. This has been so much fun, guys. I can't even imagine. Absolute blast, a genuine conversation. I loved the moment where I was trying to speak and you guys kept out talking me. That's exactly how these conversations should be, rather than me leading you through a stock set of questions. So thank you, Shiv. Thank you, Katina, so much for joining us and for the pieces that you wrote that allowed us to have this conversation. Thank you to all the people who joined in. My apologies to Rick and an anonymous attendee whose questions we will not be able to get to. But again, we have had a very powerful and fun discussion. I also want to make sure to thank all the people who made this series possible. So first of all, to the Future Tense team, including the folks at Slate, New America, ASU Center for Science and Imagination, for working with us on this collaboration. To the Principal Innovation team, the Marketing and Events team, and to my colleagues in the Office of Scholarship and Innovation at the Mary Lou Fulton Teachers College for all the work they did to make this happen. Genuinely, this has been a team effort. This is the last one of the series. I hope that we can find ways of continuing this in some way, but this has been phenomenal. To round out the series, New America and Slate will be hosting a special event on April 14th, where all three of our short story authors, Simon Brown, D. Alexander, and Shiv Ramdas, will join in, and I will moderate, and I will have the privilege of moderating that conversation. You can find out more about that at the Teachers College website by going to learningfutures.education.asu.edu. Thank you again, guys, from the bottom of my heart. This was a blast. I just had a wonderful, genuine, engaging conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. This was
Thank
very,
you, Shiv.
thank you.